Well, hi there. I want to welcome you once again to our Bible Fellowship video series as we continue pressing through, looking at the idea of commitment. And today we're talking about a really foundational thing related to commitment, and that is our commitment to the local church. We could certainly talk about this in terms of commitment to the universal church. In other words, our commitment to Christ and to the kingdom and to the greater picture. But we're really talking about the local church in this particular instance, as we're going to be looking out of some passages out of the book of Romans chapter 12 that's going to talk about this to a large degree. And so when we think about the local church, we really think about the idea of relationship. And when we talk about commitment and compare that to relationships, we need to be very careful that we don't muddy the waters there. And to illustrate that point, think about that old saying that says, any friend of yours is a friend of mine. And we understand the meaning behind that, but it might be that just because someone is a friend of yours and you're a friend of mine, it might not be that I have a lot in common with that person. And so sometimes that can be a bit of a misnomer, if you will. But we really, that idea does come to reality, come to fruition in the local church. We have a lot of people that are dissimilar to us, and yet we are in a relationship with them as part of the local church. If the church would grow and contain any kind of numbers at all, it's bound to have a collection of people that are made up of all different stripes and colors and tastes and preferences and ideas. But we are all knit together by that scarlet thread of redemption, that fact that we have a united relationship with Christ. That's what brings the local church together. And that is the thing that we need to be committed to, despite the fact that we might have some differences in our relationships, differences in our tastes and preferences, and so forth. And to illustrate that, to really talk about the importance of it, Romans chapter 12, Paul, of course, writing to the church at Rome, begins in the 3rd verse saying these words: "For by the grace given to me, I tell everyone among you not to think of himself more highly than he should think. Instead, think sensibly, as God had distributed a measure of faith to each one. Now, as we have many parts in one body, and all the parts do not have the same function, in the same way we who are many are one body in Christ and individually members of one another." You're familiar with that, I know, but it's this idea that we are all different and yet all needed. That's something that we really just need to drive home. So what does Paul say? He makes this beautiful comparison between the church and the physical body. And we've heard about that and learned about that many times. We understand that every part of the body is important, and the body doesn't function to its best capabilities if parts are either missing or not functioning and not doing the things that God designed that body to do. The church is just the same. And so we need to be careful that we are not letting differences or not letting competing ideas or thoughts destroy the relationships, the community, the commitment that we have in the local church. So you could even break it down into a small Bible fellowship class. Let's just say you're in a class and there's 15 people in there. It would be very rare to have all 15 of those people have the same political viewpoints, the same tastes in food, the same tastes in entertainment, the same taste in music, even the same ideas of what made a good sermon or bad sermon. A lot of differences exist, and yet that Bible fellowship class comes together united in that common theme of salvation, but also committed to this bigger picture of the local church. And so we understand that even though we are different, even though we are made completely unique in the eyes and in the image of God, we are all needed. Every part of the local church is needed. And so sometimes we begin thinking about this idea that even though we're interconnected, we still think that maybe one part of the body is more important than the other. And we need to just dispel that right out of the chute. And we've talked about that many times here at this church, that a toe is just as important as the heart. Everything has a role and everything has a function. And so there's nothing wasted. There's nothing useless in God's economy, in the physical body or in the local church. And so That also helps us to think about this idea, especially in challenging times that we are in right now, about a diverse look. And diverse simply means different, a wide variety. And if you look at the body parts, there's a wide variety. Can you imagine if everything on your body looked like a nose? Can you imagine if everything on your body functioned as an eye? That would be kind of silly, wouldn't it? If I want to look behind me, I would do this. Well, that would be silly. Different things look differently. My ear looks different than my elbow, which looks different from my kneecap, and I could go on and on. And so there's this wide variety of shapes and functions and design in the body, and the church would look just like that. Can you imagine if everyone in a church looked and thought and felt the exact same way? Well, the sad truth is there are some gatherings of believers, there are some churches that tend to have a real rigid set of standards, and you must look like us, and if you partake in that, you can't be part of us, or you're a different color, you're a different nationality, you don't speak our language, you do things differently than us. And so we close that door and we don't let the church grow. There's nothing sadder than that. The doors to the church ought to be open all the time. All should be welcome into the church. Now, let's understand that a person with a sinful lifestyle can't come into the church and then just impose his or her will on the church. There is a need for counseling. There's a need for discipleship. There's a need for teaching people what the scriptures say. But when we look at things like race or a political preference or music style or those sorts of things, there is room in the local church, or there should be room in the local church for everybody of every shape, every stripe, every size, and every color. And that is where we begin to see diversity as a beautiful thing. Not that we're all just some vanilla rubber stamped look-alike, but that we are part of the community that surrounds us. And so there's a lot we could talk about there, but the local church, we need to realize that we're all different. Even in a smaller church, but as churches get bigger, you're bound to find differences. And yet we are all needed and all necessary. And that gets expanded on a little bit in the next verses, 6-8. Paul writes this: according to the grace, once again, God's grace given to us, we have different gifts. And he goes on to mention some of these, not an exhaustive list. He says, if prophecy, use it according to the proportion of one's faith. If service, use it in service. If teaching, in teaching. If exhorting, in exhortation. Giving with generosity. Leading with diligence. Showing mercy with cheerfulness. And so he begins to list some of these things that we refer to as spiritual gifts. And of course, we believe the Bible teaches very clearly that when a person becomes saved, becomes a follower of Christ, they are given at least one, but certainly one spiritual gift, one supernatural thing that is given to each believer. And the purpose of that is not to exalt or lift up the believer. It is, again, to exalt or lift up Christ and to benefit the local church. And so when it again goes to this idea of differences, because we are all gifted and yet gifted different ways. And again, we can't fall into that trap to say, well, so-and-so has been gifted as a missionary, let's say, or as a pastor with a gift of prophecy. I've just been given a gift of hospitality or service, so mine's not as important as theirs. That's absolutely false. So don't let anybody tell you that all of the gifts are important. Just as there's diversity in our makeup and in our congregation, there's a great diversity in gifts. And here's what would happen in the local church. Just as if we had the lack of diversity where we all looked the same and we were all the same color and we all functioned exactly the same with no variety, imagine a church trying to be successful with only one or two of the gifts. Well, that just wouldn't work. Christ didn't give the gifts to us. The Holy Spirit doesn't come in and indwell us and empower us and give us gifts for the purpose of them not being used. All of them are vital to the health and well-being and growth of the local church. And Paul, again, doesn't go through a really exhaustive list. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 12 and Ephesians chapter 4, he mentions other gifts. And so he's not doing it as a real written down list of here are the gifts. He's using these as examples that we might find in any and every local church. Every gathering of believers that's over half a dozen or so is going to have a mixture of these gifts. And so that's most churches, certainly in our country and really in the world. And so we need to make sure that we're exercising those gifts, that we first understand what they are, and that we're putting them into practice for the purpose of building up the local church and edifying the kingdom of heaven. We've got to worship the Lord in the use of our gifts. We need to be, again, thinking about this idea of commitment, we need to make the commitment to determine what are our gifts and how can we use them, and then we commit ourselves to doing them. Now, we really see that brought into the forefront in Romans 12, 9 through 16. I'm going to give you the hint. Obviously, I've written it here. Commitment, our commitment to Christ and to his church, is seen by this idea of love. So Paul, building upon this idea that there's unique qualities in the church, that we're all different, we're all gifted in some way, he talks about how we bring that all together to demonstrate commitment. So in verse 9, he says, "Let love be without hypocrisy. Detest evil and cling to what is good." Then in verse 10, he says again, "Love one another deeply as brothers and sisters." I love what he says in this particular translation. He says, "Outdo one another in showing honor." Don't you? I love that idea of people in the church outgiving, outloving, outdoing one another to say, let me honor you before you honor me. Such a beautiful picture of how the church should function. Verse 11, "Do not lack diligence in zeal. Be fervent in the Spirit. Serve the Lord." This idea of chasing after and doing what God has called us to do. "Rejoice in hope. Be patient in affliction. Be persistent in prayer. Share with the saints in their needs. Pursue hospitality. Bless those who persecute you, and bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud. Instead, associate with the humble, and do not be wise in your own estimation." Great words there, especially that closing blow. Do not be wise in your own estimation. Traces it back to what he said in Romans 12:3 about not being so full of yourself or thinking more highly of yourself than you ought. So what is he talking about here? Well, in verse 9, we see this first idea that he says, let love be without hypocrisy. The word that he uses there is a very familiar word to you if you've been around church for any length of time. It's the Greek word agape. And that, of course, means a perfect love, a selfless love, a sacrificial love, a love that does not have any conditions placed on it. And he says that let that kind of love exist without any hypocrisy. And if you truly have agape love, you aren't going to have hypocrisy. You are going to do what he says. You're going to hate evil, and you're going to grab onto the things that are good. So that sounds great, okay? Well, okay, Pastor Chuck, if we want to have commitment to the church, we need to love. That's hard to do. That's a perfect, again, a sacrificial love. And a lot of times we struggle with that because we place conditions on other people. Even in a church relationship, we might say, well, so-and-so spoke ill of me, so I have a hard time loving him or her. There was some gossip or some stories that went around about me, so I have a hard time loving those who did that. Even within the church, we have those problems, and we need to battle through that. So how do we do that? Well, he gives us the answer in verse 10. He says, love one another deeply as brothers and sisters. But the word love there is not agape. The word love there is philos or philos. It traces back to where we get the idea of Philadelphos or Philadelphia. That again, it's this bigger idea of brotherly love. And so the idea of agape love is really this idea that really talks about that deepest kind of love. But the idea of this brotherly love is that hard work, roll your sleeves up kind of love. And so let's illustrate it this way. Perhaps we can say, if you've maybe you've experienced this, or I know as a pastor, I and many others have experienced this, where people, a husband and wife might come in for counseling, or one of the two of them might come in, and they might say a phrase like this: "I just don't think I'm in love with my spouse anymore." And that's a common idea. I'm not in love with my spouse anymore. Well, what they're saying is they don't have those perfect, warm, fuzzy, deep, romantic feelings anymore. For some reason, that has faltered or waned. And yet the advice to a couple or a person in that situation is, now more than ever is when you must love them. So you see the difference. It's the difference between a feeling of emotional love and the hard work of, I've got to make this happen. So there's a real difference there. And when we tie it, it should make sense in a marriage relationship, but if we think about it in the church, we might say, I'm committed to my church as long as I've got this unconditional, warm and fuzzy feeling, as long as everything is going great. But sometimes, even because of the diversity, even because we are different people and different tastes and different relationships, and it's a collection of people who come from different backgrounds and upbringings and races and so forth. And there might be times when we get at odds or we have disagreements, even, and that's perfectly fine within the family. But we need to understand when it gets a little more difficult, that's when we love intentionally. That's where our commitment to the church really rises. So it's easy to be committed to the church when it's doing great things for you, when the sermons are just what you want and the music style is just what you want, and people contact you, but just enough so as not to bug you, and you don't have any real demands or on your time or commitment, and there's plenty of programming for your kids and all of that great stuff. It's really easy to love the church. But when you realize that the church is imperfect, the church is made up of a lot of other people, including leaders that are imperfect, that are struggling to make sure we get it right, and we don't always. And there may be a difference in opinion on what kind of music we worship to, or what kind of style preaching that the pastor gives, or how often I'm supposed to be contacted, or I don't really feel like I've been used to the full extent of my ability. Some of those things can happen, but that's when we need to love even more intentionally. We need to communicate in those areas. We need to say, just because I might not have those warm, fuzzy feelings doesn't mean that I don't purposely act. I have to learn to demonstrate caring. I have to learn to demonstrate service. I have to learn to demonstrate zeal, even when I don't feel like it. And so the same advice we would give to a couple who is saying, I just don't feel that love, the same advice to them, which would be, work at loving each other. It would be the same advice we'd give to the local church. We're all different. We're going to have differences of opinion, differences of ideas. But especially in those times is when the church comes together and we understand that we must be committed. And sometimes that takes hard work. Sometimes it takes us loving unconditionally and loving in a forgiving way and loving as Jesus loved us. And if we could understand that, we would understand that that's why it's important to be committed to the local church. A lot of people lose their commitment to the local church, or they drop out. They stop attending, or they get dissatisfied at one church and go to another, simply because they've lost that idea of what's in it for me. If they don't get satisfied, if they don't get what they need, then they move on. Now, let me also say, there are times when that is appropriate. If you're in a church and you see something going on that's ungodly or unbiblical, you see teaching that is not honoring God, you see actions of leadership that don't honor God, you see mismanagement of finances. There's a lot of reasons why you may say, I don't really fit in there anymore. And I'm not encouraging you to leave your church, but I'm just saying sometimes the Holy Spirit may be leading us to a different place. That's a different thing than breaking our commitment. What we're talking about is the place that God has got you planted. I would encourage you, even before you leave, if you feel discontent, that is when you need to love your church even more. And it may be that at some point you feel led to move to a different place. And that's okay, because that's between God and you. But I would challenge you, do the hard work of loving your church. Maintain that commitment to the church. When we talk about that idea of relationships, and a friend of yours is a friend of mine, can you imagine if you're married and one of your friends said, boy, I really like you and I like spending time with you, I like hanging out with you, but I don't really like your spouse. Do you think that would be an issue in your friendship? I know it would be for me. If someone claims to be my friend but doesn't like my wife, then the relationship I have with her is more important than that friendship. Well, we're going to be at odds there. Well, think about this. The church is referred to in the scriptures numerous times as the bride of Christ. Can you imagine being committed to Christ and not being committed with that same degree of intensity and effort and love and service to his bride? That doesn't really make any sense. We can't dislike the church as a whole and still claim to be friends with Christ. We need to understand that even though we're different, and even though sometimes it takes hard work, especially in polarizing times, we must understand our commitment to the church is a clear indicator of our commitment to Christ, and we can't have one without the other. So as you go about this week, I'm actually making this recording before we know any election results. And so who knows what this week is going to look like, but whenever you're listening or watching this video, I want you to make the commitment. This Sunday, it doesn't matter what happens in this election. It doesn't matter what happens in any other area of our life. I want you to make the commitment to be at church on Sunday morning. Don't get so upset one way or the other that you just say you're not going to come and attend. I want to encourage you to be here at church and be part of a group of people that are focused upon the one true God. We're focused upon worshiping Jesus, not something that's happening in the world around us. And whether you can come and attend in person, or whether you have to still be watching online or prefer that right now, or feel more comfortable right now, either way is fine. I just want to encourage you to commit right now, as you're listening to this or as you're watching, say, I'm going to be at church at Chahowee Hills this Sunday morning. And come and just be part of God's people. Come and be part of that corporate worship. Come and be a part of the teaching and a part of the fellowship as we gather together. And let's together look at what tomorrow holds, and not be a bunch of individual people kind of being angry at the diversity or the change around us. Let's embrace it together, and let's double down on our commitment to Christ and to his church. So that's my word of encouragement for this week. I truly hope you have a blessed week. And again, I would encourage you, don't camp on the news channels all week. Even in the days to come, it really doesn't matter. If you're called to share your faith today, before an election result comes in, I can guarantee you're called to share your faith tomorrow after the election results come in. So we still have the same jobs to do. We still have the banner of Christ to carry to the world around us. And it might just be that in the days to come, we have an even greater opportunity to do that than we have before. So be praying this week, and again, make that commitment to not let your participation in the local church wane. That's so important and necessary for each of us. Remember, we're all different, but we're all needed. We need you to come and be a part of this church and use the gifts that God has given you, so together we can make a difference for his kingdom. Hope you have a great week, and we look forward to seeing you Sunday. God bless.